Those Magnificent Men in Their Flying Machines, or How I Flew from London to Paris in 25 hours and 11 minutes, is the longest movie I've ever seen, at least in terms of the length of the title. Now, last week, I made a terrible mistake. I said that Who is Harry Kellerman, and why is he saying those terrible things about me, has the longest title of any Academy Award nominee. And that is obviously not true, because this movie was nominated for an Academy Award, and it came out in 1965, well before Who is Harry Kellerman, and so on. I guess both of these have now been dethroned by Borat, which has some really long subtitle that I'm not going to commit to memory. And I'm not going to tell you that that's the longest one, because at this point, who knows, I'm done making any claims. This mistake hurt me. It made me physically sick. Or maybe that was licking the floor of the subway. Either way, my voice has only just come back. The video's a bit delayed. Fortunately, this is the only error that I've ever made on the channel, and the only one I ever will make. Otherwise, I would be in quite poor health. Now, if you saw this movie as a child and you have nostalgic feelings about it, turn off the video now. Well, I'm not actually going to spend too much time reviewing it. There are a couple of other videos on this very site which summarize the plot and hype up some of the somewhat mediocre humor. This movie does have one cool element, I think, which is all the replica airplanes that were built and flown for the film. There are some great practical effects here, and some not that great special effects. The Wikipedia article about the film has a bunch of information about all the different aircraft that are in the movie, and I'm not going to repeat that here, but it's worth checking out. Instead, I want to traverse the iceberg of analyses of this film, starting with some of the most conspicuous stuff and finishing with the bizarre conclusions that my febrile mind leapt to. Before we get into that, I will mention two kind of structural issues that I felt imbalanced the movie a little bit. First, there's a love triangle at the center of the film between a stereotypical American and a stereotypical Brit. They are both trying to woo Sarah Miles. The modern actress Katherine Parkinson sort of reminds me of Sarah Miles. Anyway, the movie does not do a good job with this dynamic. It doesn't give the audience strong reasons to root for one of these guys or the other one. I was expecting that maybe they would make a pact or something, that the winner of the race would get the girl. Well, there's no such drama, and it's not even totally clear how the movie ends. Maybe I'm being a little bit obtuse here, but given how unsubtle most of the movie is, this central dynamic is pretty vague. It's possible that this was an inevitable result of who paid for the movie. Who paid for the movie? Well, this is a British movie at its core, but it was funded largely by 20th Century Fox, Daryl F. Zanuck. And I guess having some tension between a Brit and an American is in theory a great way to draw in audiences from both places. I'm sure it was clear from the beginning that this was going to be a movie that could be distributed all over the world. So in some ways, it's a convenient plot device until you have to start figuring out which one is the good guy, which one is the hero. This is probably why the movie ends up being a little bit toothless, not really taking sides. Of course, love triangles don't have to take sides, but again, this is not a particularly subtle movie, and the fact that there isn't more clearly defined drama there hurts it. In general, there isn't a lot of plot in the film at all. We've got a big race, and we've got a bunch of caricatures, with some not particularly engaging subplots. It's telling that in this movie, you really don't care who wins the race. You don't care who wins the race. I think that's a sign that something went a little bit wrong. Having said that, you might enjoy the movie anyway for its antics and its aircraft. That's kind of what's at the center of it. Another imbalance in the movie is that it's kind of built like an epic film. It has an intermission, a long opening frame. We'll talk about that more later, probably. It goes on to introduce the competitors from all the different countries, and it really takes its time in doing this. Gives us a little vignette of the guy in France. Then we go to Italy. We trot around the globe, and you think, okay, we're really in this for the long haul. It's setting itself up to be really big. But like I said, there isn't really a plot to follow on from this, and there isn't much jeopardy. So the epic formula doesn't really play out. And actually, the movie is only 2 hours and 18 minutes long, including the intermission. And I'm not saying it should be any longer, but for how much setup there is, the story itself is lacking, and the pacing feels kind of weird. Okay, let's get to the interesting stuff. At the tip of the iceberg, the most obvious thing to say about this movie is probably how it relates to the jet age and the space race, modern advancements in aviation. This is in the movie itself, in fact, which finishes by jumping forward in time to an airport where Red Skelton is trying to get on a plane. So the movie, like I said, this is kind of shoving this theme in your face. It's also, alluded to in the title. Even in 1965, 25 hours would be a long time to get from London to Paris. And a big part of the humor in this movie is how quaint early aviation was, how even flying more than a few miles seems outlandish. For instance, there's a joke where the Japanese pilot shows up in his plane, and they say, oh, the rumor is he flew all the way from Japan. And someone asks him, how did you get here? And he describes taking a ferry, taking a train, and then flying just the last few miles. So there's a lot of jokes in this movie that are built on, hey, what's the gap between aviation today and aviation back then? Let me touch on two quirks of how the movie portrays flying. First of all, it has a nod to the Wright brothers. The American character is named Orville. He doesn't have much else in common with the Wright brothers. Perhaps his airplane looks a little bit like the Wright Flyer. The movie's set in 1910, when the Wright Flyers were already kind of old technology. It's possible that there is some pandering happening here by alluding to the Wright brothers, although some people might actually expect them to have a larger role in the movie. There's an interesting balance in the film between historical accuracy and something more fanciful. They use a bunch of replica aircraft in the film, for instance, largely based on real planes from the time. That's a lot of messing around, a lot of work to do for some kind of historical, some semblance of historical accuracy, right? They really built all these planes. They got people to fly them. That takes a lot of time and money. But on the other hand, the film isn't based on any true story at all. And in a few places, it takes some significant liberties, some interesting liberties. For instance, there are a couple of prototype aircraft in the film that could not fly in real life, but can sort of fly in the movie. There's a plane with wings that flap up and down like a bird, and this should be able to fly, I would say, up to about 0 feet, or 0 meters for our metric viewers. But thanks to some actually quite good special effects, it bounces up into the air a couple of times. Why do they do that? There's something similar in the opening montage for the film. There's this montage of early flight, which is kind of crafted like a black and white movie. That's sort of an interesting move, by the way, that is like, oh, we're showing older stuff, so let's kind of do it in the style of black and white films. Red Skelton shows up here. He's trying about a bunch of different early flight contraptions. At first, you could almost mistake some of this stuff for historical footage, particularly if you don't know who Red Skelton is or what he looks like. You could think it's newsreel stuff until some implausible craft take to the air. And again, it's an interesting mix of something historical with something else. It is kind of puzzling in a way, but I think what's going on here is, like I mentioned, it's a fanciful movie, and it's taking these liberties very deliberately. But that's quite an interesting balance. Next on the iceberg is the post-war psychology of the movie. This is a film from after World War II, set before World War I, that features most of the nations from those conflicts. The thing that might make or break the movie for most people is how all these characters come off. If you don't find the stuff amusing, you probably aren't going to like the movie. Now, how all this relates to the wars is a big question, and I cannot answer that fully here, but clearly these characters are salient in part because of the war. The German and Japanese characters in particular foreshadow something in the past. The Japanese pilot is perhaps the least lampooned character in the film, which is kind of interesting. The dubbing there is quite jarring. Anyway, you could try to claim that this is some kind of post-war reconciliation. Could be. It is playing off international conflict and stereotype, yes, but in a way that is peaceful. Of course, aircraft would be a big part of both world wars. The last thing to note here is that there are a lot of other movies like this, such as Those Daring Young Men in Their Jaunty Jalopies. Yes, that is a real movie directed by Ken Anakin, same guy who made this movie, as a follow-up to this one, I think. You might say that something like Around the World in 80 Days was a precursor. These big international race movies with some amount of international casting are an interesting niche of post-war cinema. We could also talk about the Britishness of this movie, and how that intersects with farce and national identity and things like that. I'll skip over this for now. Next on the iceberg is the role of women in the movie. Sarah Miles' character is fairly progressive. She has a motorcycle that she owns in secret and stashes in a shed. The shed has a poster on the wall that's in support of women's suffrage, 1910. She wants to go flying, but her father won't allow it. This is sort of looking towards some of the 1960s cultural shifts. But on the other hand, I Irina Demick is in the movie playing a sex object who doesn't really even have a name. Apparently, she was going out with Darryl Evazanic, the producer of the film, at the time. This is not as progressive, and these are basically the only two women in the movie. I guess the Italian guy has his wife there, too. Most of these adventure movies that I mentioned above are mostly about men. There's more to say here, but let's keep going down the iceberg. I guess I'd just say, yeah, the movie is at best trying to have it two ways, which is in fact very, very common for mainstream movies, to be a little bit edgy and a little bit regressive. That's kind of the name of the game. Is there anything more than that going on here? I'm not sure. I have actually quite a bit to say about the title of the movie, and maybe more generally, movies with titles that have the word "or" in them. The word "or." Why do movies do this? They couldn't decide between two titles. I guess often what we have is kind of a subtitle, a title, and then like a tagline, almost. Some people would call it an alternate title. None of these terms are really well-defined at all. This format is nothing new, that's for sure. For instance, Twelfth Night was really called Twelfth Night, or What You Will. Origin of the Species is really called On the Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of the Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Unfortunately, that was never nominated for an Academy Award. The practical purpose for these titles, I guess, is not too hard to guess at. Twelfth Night's second title is just as cryptic as the first one, at least to modern readers, but usually the alternate title offers some more info into what is going on. I guess it's a way to make the story a little more intriguing, a little more accessible or intriguing. In film, something else tends to be going on, I think. The most famous example of an alternate title is Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. Neither that alternate title nor this one really explain what is happening. They don't make the movie any more accessible, I would argue. If anything, they add some more mysterious sort of hooks to the title. Now, I'm not going to get into Dr. Strangelove today, but in this movie, the idea, I think, with this title is probably partly to invoke an old-timey feel. As I've said, the movie is quaint and fanciful, and the really long title probably helps with that. But here's something weird. The alternate title is in the first person. How I flew from London to Paris. Who is this? Who's speaking here? Who's I? This film has no first-person perspective. There is a little bit of narration, but it's not at all obvious how this fits in with the title. Interestingly, the alternate title of Dr. Strangelove is also in the first person. That movie did come out the year before this one, so maybe it was just fairly direct inspiration, even though the movies are extremely different for the most part. Since then, we haven't really had a lot of "or" titles. Anyway, let me know what you think. Why is it in first person? That's interesting. One other note about the timing here. They say 25 hours and 11 minutes, sort of asserting that the timing is very important. One thing that really annoys me about this movie is that when we finally reach the end of the race, they count the winner as the first person to cross the finish line, to arrive at the finish line, for the last leg. But in a race with many different legs that are timed individually, the person who finishes, who happens to arrive at the end of the last leg first, is not necessarily the winner, unless you maybe stagger the starts or something like that, but there's no indication of that. And they even foreground the timing of the thing being important in the title, right? But the time is never really mentioned afterwards. They don't give any details. They probably thought, oh, it's too complicated to actually show the time or something like that, even though I think it maybe would have been interesting. And then, yeah, they don't even sort of address the timing mechanism, how this sort of race would actually be run. So anyway, I don't think it's a fatal flaw, but it annoyed me. Anyway, I had a few more things to talk about in this video, but I got sick and ran out of time, sort of forgot what even happens in the movie. I'm losing my voice as we speak, so let's not drag on. Next week, I think we'll return to really challenging and confounding movies, but we aren't totally done with the long title theme. I'm eyeing up a movie with a very long word in the title and a colon and a very intriguing subtitle as well. I'll see you for that.